All right, welcome. Today, we are diving into a question that's frankly fascinating. It sits right at the intersection of public health and brain science. Is there really a link between the common vaccines we get and our risk of developing dementia? The answer, as you'll see, is a total scientific detective story.
I mean, just think about it. Dementia affects a mind-boggling 50 million people around the world. And with populations getting older, that number is on track to triple. So the idea that something we already do, something as simple as a routine shot, could actually be a shield against it, that's a huge deal. But where did this idea even come from?
Well, it all goes back to something called the infectious hypothesis. And this isn't some newfangled theory. Scientists have been kicking this idea around for over 100 years. The basic thought is this: when your body fights off an infection, it can sometimes trigger inflammation. And if that inflammation happens in the brain, over and over again, it might contribute to the kind of damage we see in diseases like Alzheimer's. So the logic is pretty straightforward, right? If you use a vaccine to stop the infection, maybe, just maybe, you can stop the dementia that follows.
Okay, but here's where our mystery really kicks off. When scientists actually started to dig into the real-world data, they found, well, the complete opposite of a clear answer. Some huge studies came out and said, yep, vaccines are linked to a lower risk of dementia. But then another absolutely massive study comes along and finds the total opposite, an increased risk. So what is going on? How can both of these things possibly be true? Let's start following the clues. So let's start with the one that probably made your ears perk up. The shocking and honestly kind of scary finding, the study that suggested vaccines increase dementia risk. Now, you gotta stick with me here, because how we solve this part of the puzzle is a perfect example of how science is supposed to work. The evidence for this increased risk comes from a big 2023 study by a team led by a researcher named Duros. And when I say big, I mean big. This was not some small-time project. They looked at the health records of over 13 million people in the UK. 13 million. And they were looking for a connection between common vaccines, like the flu shot or pneumonia vaccine, and whether these people were later diagnosed with dementia. And here is the big, flashy headline result that came out of it. The study found that getting any of these common vaccines was linked to an odds ratio of 1.38 for dementia. Now, what does that mean in plain English? It means a 38% increased risk compared to people who didn't get the vaccines. Wow, that sounds really bad, right? But hold on, because that is not where this story ends. Because here is the most important part, and this comes straight from the researchers themselves. The very scientists who found this scary-looking number didn't actually believe it was real. They wrote in their own conclusion that the culprit probably wasn't the vaccine at all. Instead, they pointed the finger at a kind of statistical illusion, a ghost in the machine, called detection bias. So what on earth is detection bias? It's a super common trap in this kind of research. Basically, it's what happens when one group of people in the study is just, being watched more closely by doctors than the other group. And because they're being watched more, they get diagnosed with things more often. It looks like they're sicker, but really, they're just getting noticed more. Here's a perfect analogy for how it played out here. Just think about it for a second. The kind of person who's really on top of getting their annual flu shot, what else are they probably doing? They're probably also seeing their doctor for regular checkups, right? Well, every single one of those extra doctor visits is another chance for a doctor to notice the very first subtle signs of cognitive decline. To ask, hey, how's your memory been? These are things that might go totally unnoticed for years in someone who avoids the doctor. So the vaccinated group ends up with more dementia diagnosis, not because the shot caused it, but because they're simply under a closer medical microscope. And the researchers had more proof for this idea. Take a look at this. They did something clever. They introduced what's called a lag period. So instead of looking at diagnoses right after a vaccine, they only counted diagnoses that happened, say, 5 or even 10 years later. And what happened? That scary increased risk started to melt away. The longer the lag period, the smaller the risk became. Now, if the vaccine were actually causing dementia, you wouldn't expect the effect to just fade over time. This is a huge clue that the original number was just a statistical ghost. Okay, so we've pretty much explained away the increased risk as a phantom in the data. But what about all those other studies, the ones that found a decreased risk? Well, this next clue suggests that maybe we've been asking the wrong question the whole time. See, instead of asking if vaccines in general affect dementia risk, what if the real key is the type of vaccine? What if some of them contain a special ingredient that changes the entire equation?
And that brings us to the second major piece of evidence, a study from a team led by Taquet. They zoomed in on two specific newer vaccines, the Shingrix vaccine for shingles and the RXV vaccine for RSV. And they did something really smart. They used a huge U.S. health database and compared people who got these vaccines to a control group of people who just got a regular old flu shot. This helps them sidestep that whole detection bias problem we just talked about, because both groups are seeing a doctor.
And what they found was pretty incredible. People who got the Shingrix vaccine had an 18% lower risk of being diagnosed with dementia over the next year and a half. A lower risk.
And get this, for the RSV vaccine, or RexV, the effect was even bigger. For that group, the risk of a dementia diagnosis dropped by 29%. So what in the world do these two vaccines, for two totally different viruses, have in common?
This is it. This is the aha moment in our detective story. The common denominator, the one crucial clue linking these two vaccines, is a special ingredient called the AS01 adjuvant. Both Shingrix and RexV have it, and both are linked to a lower risk of dementia. This tells us it's probably not about stopping shingles or RSV specifically. It's about this one shared component. So now we can finally bring the two halves of our story together. We've busted the myth of an increased risk, showing it was just a statistical fluke. And now we've identified a potential hero in this story, this AS01 adjuvant. And this is the central idea that the Taquet study puts forward. They basically suggest that the AS01 adjuvant itself might be playing a direct protective role in the brain. So it's not just about preventing an infection, it's about what this specific ingredient does to our entire immune system.
So what exactly is an adjuvant? Think of it like a hype man for a vaccine. It's an ingredient they add to some vaccines to really wake up your immune system and get it to mount a much stronger defense. The AS01 adjuvant specifically is made of two cool things, a detoxified molecule from bacteria and a purified extract from something called the soap bark tree. It is designed to be a really powerful immune boost.
And here is the really cool part, the potential way this could actually work to protect our brains. So those components in AS01, they fire up very specific pathways in your immune system. This sets off a whole chain reaction, a cascade of signaling molecules called cytokines. This whole cascade eventually leads to the production of this really powerful substance called interferon gamma. And here is the kicker. Totally separate studies, done in mice, have shown that this interferon gamma might actually help the brain clear out those sticky amyloid plaques, which, as you know, are a classic hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So, after following all the twists and turns, what's the final verdict in our scientific detective story? What does this all really mean for us? The big takeaway, really, is all about nuance. Science is almost never a simple yes or no answer. That initial contradiction we started with, that wasn't a mistake or a failure. It was a crucial part of the journey. It taught us a super important lesson about statistical bias, and it forced scientists to dig deeper. It pushed them away from a big, blurry question about all vaccines and toward a much sharper, more focused question about one specific ingredient. And in doing that, it has opened up an absolutely thrilling new pathway for dementia research. And that's really why this matters so much. The point isn't that you should run out and get a specific vaccine to cure dementia tomorrow. It's the profound idea behind it all, that by stimulating our own immune system in a very targeted way, we might be able to actively protect our brains. It suggests that learning how to fine-tune our own immune response, well, that could be the next great frontier in the fight against this truly devastating disease.